Okay, so where did we leave off on Tuesday? We were talking about theories of attribution. So we talked about Descartes and the model of Descartes' model of rationality, and the Enlightenment kind of theory of the rational mind, and this kind of baseline idea that philosophers and economists and logicians have historically had, that we think in a rational way. And this forms, we don't really believe this in social psychology, but it forms a sort of useful baseline from which we can talk about cognitive biases, departures from rationality, and so on. Because in a lot of ways we do think rationally, but all those departures are really where social psychology gets really interesting. Okay, so we talked about Fritz Heider's research. We watched that cool film, or I found this a cool film, with the triangles that were males and the circles that were female or whatever, but that's debatable. We talked about Jones and Harris and Ross et al., and we talked about three big ideas. The correspondence bias, the fundamental attribution error, and the actor-observer bias. And these three ideas sort of build on one another. So the correspondence bias is a tendency that we have to make correspondent attributions when we see other people's behaviors. So when we see somebody do something, we tend to say they must have a correspondent disposition or a correspondent set of attitudes to that behavior. And that set of attitudes, that personality, their character, their disposition, cause that behavior. The fundamental attribution error is a very similar idea. It just goes one step further. It says we tend to make these dispositional attributions even when we ought to be making more situational attributions. So we tend to see people's behavior as being caused by their internal states and don't take account of the situation. And there was a mechanism, a reason why social psychologists think this is the case. Why they think, oh, well, actually, let me add the third one. So the third one is the actor-observer bias. And the actor-observer bias essentially says we do the fundamental attribution error when we think about the causes of other people's behaviors, but when we think about the causes of our own behavior, we take proper account of the situation. And there's a mechanism that can explain that. Do you remember this mechanism? Good, good. Okay, that's good. Everybody's nodding. I like that. That mechanism is focalism, and it's your perspective, your focus of attention. When you view other people, you see them, and you see them as likely the cause of the behavior. But when you see your own behaviors, you don't see yourself. You see out, and you see the situation. You see the context you're in, and it's much easier for you to make attributions to the situation or the context that you're in. And we talked about some of these examples. And one thing that we added at the end was a more nuanced model of attributions that adds in an extra wrinkle of motivated reasoning. And when you add this in, it's like basically a fourth layer of ideas from this lecture, which says that we tend to make correspondent attributions of other people's behaviors, even when we ought to be making more situational attributions. For our own behaviors, we tend to make situational attributions, except when we do something awesome, in which case we claim credit for it and make a dispositional attribution. So I use this example where you see somebody do something, you tend to make a dispositional attribution. You do something good, you make a dispositional attribution. You do something bad, you tend to make a situational attribution. And think about this, right? When you do well on a test, what caused that? You caused that. When you do poorly on a test, what caused that? Your lack of sleep. Okay, that's a good example. Yes, question.
Is that kind of the same thing as saying you're making excuses for your own behavior or you're justifying your behavior?
Is this the same as saying you're making excuses or justifying your behavior? Yes, this is a fancy-pants social psychology way of saying that. But I think it's more than that. They're trying to build a larger theory of how it is that you identify causality in your social world. So I think it is a little bit more than just saying people rationalize or justify their behaviors. Motivated reasoning is mostly that. But the motivated theory of attributions, or this motivated reasoning nuanced model of attributions I'm presenting here, is a specific wrinkle on theories of attributions, which are theories of how we assess causality in our social world, which, if you think about it, is incredibly important. And this is why people like Fritz Heider, when they went to go invent the field of social psychology in the 1940s, they started with the simplest stuff. Just when you look out at the world, how do you decide what causes what? And it's a great place to start, and that's why we started the class there. Okay, and I showed you a picture of Dixon. who I talked to yesterday, and he did not get me in trouble. Okay, so how should you attribute? How should you make attributions about the behaviors you observe in the world, either your own or others? How should you do it? Well, according to sociologists and social psychologists, you should rely heavily on the situation or context. So being in this class, that's going to be the big story of this class in a lot of ways, is that fundamentally your life is a social life. And the people around you, the causes of their behaviors are fundamentally social. And that's going to be sort of the big message of this class. And I'm going to find about 20 different ways to say that to you over the course of this semester. And that could get boring. That could get real boring. But, we'll see. So is this right? Is this kind of overarching theory of sociology and social psychology that your environment, your context, social structure, the situations you find yourself in, these are the overriding causes of your behavior, not your disposition or your personality? You might be saying, what about personality, right? That's what I think most people think makes events in the world. And you might be saying, is the situation ever irrelevant? Is it ever the case that just personality causes behavior? Do people behave the same across situations? Because that's sort of what personality is all about, right? If you have a personality, and personality is what's causing your behaviors, and situations are less important, that means you're probably going to behave the same across different situations, right? If the situation's more important, it's saying essentially you don't have personality, you won't be consistent across situations, your behavior's capricious and guided by the context you're in. Now, of course, I want to say right now, the answer is obviously both, right? It's obviously the case that you have personality. You all especially have a lot of personality. And it's obviously also the case that situations matter as well. But let's delve a little bit deeper into this debate of situation versus personality now. So this guy, Walter Mischel, and this is a picture of Walter Mischel, he laid down a challenge in 1968. He was a personality and social psychology researcher. And what he got frustrated with was he was looking at what we call effect sizes, the degree to which personality seemed to explain behavior. He was looking at the effect sizes for our measures of personality constructs. And he was like, man, these are really low. These are not nearly as high as they ought to be if we're going to believe that personality really matters. So what he was finding was, and this may or may not be meaningful to you, but he was finding correlations between personality and then correspondent behaviors of about 0.40. I know. Just 0.40, my God. But, cool your jets. Just go with this. He was finding these correlations of only 0.40, and he was like, this is not good. This is not good. What that means is that personality explains about 16% of the variance of behavior. That means that if you wanted to explain behavior and you think personality is what predicts it, it only predicts about 16% of it. You have to square a correlation in order to find out the percent of variance explained. It's complicated, but 0.4 squared is 0.16. Question? Don't people put themselves in the situations? That's the next slide. So yes, I agree with you. I'm going to make that point in about 2 minutes. Okay, so what Mischel is saying is personality doesn't seem to matter as much as we think. And he basically, so he was making the tough claim. He was saying when we measure personality, it doesn't predict behavior very well. But you might be saying, well, we just don't measure personality that well. That doesn't mean personality doesn't exist and predict behaviors a lot. I mean, that's what you walked into this class thinking, right, was that people make their actions, make their behaviors, determine their fates and whatnot. Or at least that's what I walked into my social psych class with. So maybe you're saying right now, this is a little overstated, right? And it's really just an artifact of personality psychologists not being perfect at measuring personality. And this is a very good point. So another way to measure personality indirectly is to say, to what extent are we consistent across situations? To what extent are you extroverted in one room and extroverted in another room? To what extent are you neurotic on Tuesday and also neurotic on Saturday in your behaviors? And when they do analyses of that, of cross-situational consistency, where they're not even trying to measure the personality factor, they're just measuring behaviors that it would predict and saying, we don't even know what behavior it is, but just personality, if it exists, has got to show some consistency of behaviors across situations. Even when they do that, they don't do very well. The correlations across situations are not that good. And of course now sociologists and social psychologists love this, right? They're like, yes, exactly, that's what we've been telling you. You're a different person when you're in this room than when you walk out of this room and you're in another room. And you're a different person in that room than when you go home and you're with your mom or whatever, or interacting with your roommate or something. And this is the sociologist's delight, right? They love Walter Mischel for having said this. But this is an extremely controversial thesis, and it has a lot of problems. And as I said, the answer, the truth, is somewhere in between. It's certainly the case that situations matter and personality matters. But what are some of the reactions to Mischel's thesis, to the challenge of 1968? What did people say? What did personality researchers come back with when they went to go counter this stiff uppercut from Walter Mischel? They said, first, personalities affect what situations you wind up in, as this woman here said. Very good point. To a large extent, these things are inseparable. And your disposition, your extroversion, for example, will put you in situations like parties where you will then behave differently. And it will have an indirect effect on your behavior through the choice of the situations you wind up in. Great point. Great point. Personality affects situation. But another point is that personality and situation interact. You may have kind of situation-specific personalities that are nonetheless consistent. So you might be a very extroverted person in your family environment, and you always are. Like every time you go home for Thanksgiving or what have you, you really are an extroverted person interacting with your family. But then at school, you're pretty shy for some reason, and you always are. You're very consistent. So maybe you could have domain-specific personality types. And that's one of the kind of big areas of research in social psychology now is person-situation interactions. And that's sort of both are true then, right? It's the situation matters and personality matters. Also, they said if you measure personality in different ways, like cross-situational behavioral consistency, like I was saying, you get higher estimates. So Mischel was kind of using the toughest data to slam the personality people and was perhaps not being fair. And then also, instead of just saying everything that isn't personality must be the situation, why don't you look at situation effects and how much variance is explained by situations? And that's not that much higher. Or sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's not. It depends what we're talking about. So the personality response is pretty strong. And I'm going to leave it up to you to decide. And I think one way to decide is look at all the research that we're going to present in class and look at the rates of behavior in the different conditions of the study. Because what's going to happen over and over is we're going to present experiments or other study findings in this class where social psychologists have systematically altered the situation in some way. And if the social psychologists are right, that situations matter a ton and personality doesn't matter nearly as much, then you're going to see huge differences, right, when they tweak the situation. But if the personality people are right, the situations don't matter that much, and personality matters a ton, then you're going to see really small differences because you can't change the person's personality. You're changing the situation they're in, and you're having a very small effect on the outcome. Question in the back.
Doesn't that not really work, though? Because once someone's been in a situation already, they can alter the way that they handle it in the future.
Yes.
Measuring it scientifically, it's not that scientific.
Oh, I wouldn't go. Okay, so the question is, doesn't that not work because once somebody's been in one situation, they behave differently when they're in another situation? People react to being observed in the second time. Yes, but what I'm talking about is when for example, a two-condition experiment where people are not in both conditions. They're randomly assigned to be in one or the other, and we run a bunch of people, and we use random assignment so that the pools of these people are roughly the same. Yeah, they're roughly the same in terms of their characteristics, and then we're going to compare them. And the only thing that should be different is the situation. And we've used random assignment to equalize the personality types in these two pools. And again, if the situation people are right, there should be a big difference. If personality people are right, small difference. It's a good point. That applies to what we call within subjects experiments, when the subjects participate in every condition of the study. And then you have a big concern about, did their participation in the first condition affect their participation in the second? Like you wouldn't want to run the Milgram obedience experiment that way because people, they can't be tricked twice, right? So it's an excellent question. Another question.
Did Mischel show anything about the individual variations and the consistency of behavior?
This is another very good point. Did Mischel show individual variance in how consistent people were across situations? Mischel didn't, but personality researchers reacting to Mischel have pointed exactly that out. They've said people vary in how consistent they are. So for some people, you're overgeneralizing with this personality versus situation thing. People themselves vary in how much their personality matters and causes them to be consistent across situations. In a sense, there's variance in integrity, you know. where integrity isn't like moral fiber, but rather consistency across situations. So that's an excellent point. There's some other points that are, but then the situation people come back and say, yeah, but you've also oversimplified situations. And there's a lot of research showing that there are strong situations and weak situations. So some situational differences are very small and they won't create a big difference. But then there's some situations where when you're in it, it's such a strong situation that everybody roughly acts the same. Like look at the military or something like that. People start to behave in a very specific way that's very different from the world they came from when they enlist in the military. It's a very strong situation. And it's definitely a world where personality matters less. Berkeley, you come to Berkeley, you can be yourself, you can express your personality. It's not a strong situation. Well, it is in certain ways, I guess. There's another question over here. Okay, that question's gone. Any other questions? These are excellent questions. I like them. Sir. Okay, what's my own opinion? I say it's three things. People matter. Personalities exist. There is cross-situational consistency, no question. Personality is part of the story. Situation matters as well. Just look at the effect sizes for these experiments. You'll believe it too. And then I think person-time-situation interactions matter as well. I know what I'm doing is basically saying everybody's right, and it's kind of a boring answer. But I think it's the true answer. I think it's the honest answer. Is those three classes explain most of behavior. But then I also think there's, not to make it even more complicated, but I think it's very nuanced in terms of where these things come from. I think people pick situations, and I also think circumstances create your personality. So I find them almost inseparable. So your life growing up has a lot to do with who you are, and who you are has a lot to do with the life you then choose after that, and so the two are sort of inextricably linked. But at many points in this class, we're going to try to separate them for conceptual clarity and say what matters more, the situation or who you are. Questions? Yes? Is anything not explicable with personality or situation? Yes, and in fact, in terms of this metric we use of variance explained, which is like basically how much have we explained, people's behavior. Generally speaking, the biggest category would be not explained, like where we just haven't captured it. Now, I can't really think of like what else matters besides personality, situation, their interaction, especially with situation broadly defined to include social structure, culture, all that stuff. So I think those classes, those categories of factors are pretty exhaustive. But at an operational level, at an empirical level, we fail to explain the majority of human behavior because you guys are so complicated. There was another question. We're all complicated. It's beautiful. So that's another message you can take from the class is, even at the end of all this science, you're still pretty damn unpredictable to even the smartest social scientists in the world, and probably always will be. Yeah. What about body chemistry, biology, hormones, maybe even genes? Well, let's put genes aside. But yeah, so hormones and stuff like that. Here, I'm thinking of that as helping to form your personality. That any of these things where they're relatively constant, like maybe your basal testosterone level or your serotonin levels, which have chronic effects on your personality, I'm kind of lumping that into the personality category for this purpose. They're usefully separated for research purposes. Another question? Okay. All right. Yes. What's up? Christy, how are you? We know each other now. This is good.
Do you think it's important to know the names of all these men?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. There will be some women too, by the way, I promise. It's not just men. I got that point. You got that in there. That's good. And it's a good point, and I endorse that point. There will be some women eventually. Let's pay more attention to their names, I mean, it is pretty important to catch their names, yeah. Some of the questions will refer to them. Yeah, so yes. Other questions? Okay, all right, let's get going. Let's get moving, okay. All right, so another man. Sorry. So then, how do we overcome the fundamental attribution error? Okay, I've told you all this stuff about how we tend to, when we view other people's behavior, we over-attribute to their dispositions, their personalities, and not enough to the situation. And then I told you a story about how Walter Mischel said, that's really stupid because personality doesn't explain that much. So then what are we supposed to do? Okay. All right, so what are we supposed to do? How do you overcome the fundamental attribution error? So Dan Gilbert is a social psychologist at Harvard. You may have heard of him. Have you heard of him? Who's heard of him? I've heard of him. He was on, I think, the Colbert Report recently, Colbert Report, and he's a very interesting social psychologist, very interesting guy. He does like sci-fi writing in his spare time. He like dropped out of high school. He went to high school in Ithaca, where I went to grad school, and he dropped out and he drove like a VW bus across the country to, I think, here actually, of course, and where he must have left his VW bus because we have so many, and hung out here for a while, and then decided to go back to college, and then became, one of the 5 most famous social psychologists in the world. And Dan Gilbert's done a lot of kick-ass research on the fundamental attribution error. And his idea is, again, this anchor and adjustment idea, which I've been talking to you about a little bit in the past when I talked about why people do the above-average effect. And anchor and adjustment is just a fundamental model of how we think, of how cognition works. And in the anchor and adjustment model, what happens is you have some kind of first thought that sort of anchors your thoughts in some area. And then you very effortfully adjust that in light of new information. And we think in social psychology that a lot of thought processes, a lot of reasoning works on a sort of anchor and adjustment model. And the way I always think of it is you like nail a nail down and then you pull a rubber band from that nail, and you can only get so far because that first impression, that first thought is very sticky. And it's hard to ever get to reality. I mean, maybe you get to reality because reality isn't that far from your first thought, but you often don't get to the truth. So what Gilbert says is we anchor on a correspondent attribution. Our first thought is, Joe did that, so it's Joe's personality that's responsible for that. Then we effortfully take into account the context. We take into account further information. So we might say, Sally did that, but then again, Sally's having a bad day. Sally's really tired, and so maybe that isn't really that Sally is, mad at me or something like that. So we effortfully take into account this further information to adjust our attributions, taking into account the situation. But we, again, just like pulling the rubber band from the nail, we rarely adjust enough. Okay, so we never quite get to, wait, actually, it is truly just that Sally's having a bad day and she didn't get enough sleep. She's not a bad person. We never quite get there to the truth. But you maybe can with effort. And so without effort, it's hard to take into account the situation. And taking into account the situation requires great effort. So therefore, you must try to take other people's perspective. You have to try to shift your focalism to other people's eyes. So you have to try to overcome that tendency, the bias that's created by the fact that your eyes are locked in your head and not in other people's heads. And if you could shift your eyes to other people's heads, then you would be able to see their situation as well as you can see your own. And then you'd be able to see their perspective, and you'd make more accurate attributions because you'd be able to take into account the situation. Hey, could you all that are in the back there that are talking loudly stop talking? You, please stop talking. Thank you. Okay, so you have to try to take other people's perspective. So this brings up this famous quote that you've probably heard before that comes from a Lakota Sioux prayer. Great Spirit, grant that I may not criticize my neighbor until I've walked a mile in his moccasins, or her moccasins. I'm working on that. They did say his. It's not my fault. And this is a great principle of social psychology, that if you want to really, really make the right attributions, you got to take other people's perspectives. This will help you avoid conflicts. This will help you relate to people better. This will help you understand people better. But there's another reason to do it. It's because it's right. It's because it's honest and truthful. And it's the same reason you went to college, right? You wanted to learn. You wanted to get it right. So if you want to get it right in the course of everyday social perception and social cognition, and make the right attributions and understand the world and the causal relationships in your social world as accurately as possible, if you want to learn something from social psychology, this is a great principle to follow. You got to stop and take other people's perspectives, and then you'll better understand the causes of their behavior. Which leads us to the follow-up assignment to the assignment you turned in today, and this is due on Tuesday. I want you to write another short description of the exact same conflict that you picked, that you wrote on for today, explain the causes and the content of the conflict, detail what happened. However, write it from the other person's perspective. Right, I know. Awful. Awful. What a terrible experience this will be for you. I know. No matter how wrong they were, I know. They were wrong. I know. That's what. No, okay. What were you going to say? You already did that? Then you got an A+ in this class, sir, because you take the perspective of the other like a magician. I don't know. Do it again, I guess. Do it again. Try and do it even more fluently. Try and top yourself. You know, do it even better if you can. Okay. Shh. And I want you to imagine that literally the other person is in this class. The other person might be in this class, actually, and that's awkward. But I want you to imagine that the other person got the last assignment full of excitement. Exactly what would they write? Exactly what would they write if they were in this class, got the same assignment, and they went to go. They picked the same conflict. They thought of their conflict with you, and they went to go write this essay. There's a question there.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I might not be getting this right simply because when I was writing the argument that we had from my own perspective, because it was not a very dramatic thing, it was just like a long, let's call it discussion.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's very mature.
It really wound up being more like my feelings on the subject that I was telling her, and now I'm going to give her feelings, and it's turning into be much more about the thing we were arguing about than about the argument.
Okay. I mean, yeah, no, so what about, I mean, basically I'm going to put this into a class of concerns of like, what if my first assignment doesn't lend itself to this assignment, this follow-up assignment? Because we could ask, there's probably a variety of things like that that we could talk about. If that's the case, that your first assignment did not lend itself to doing this assignment for whatever reason, find a new conflict that does lend itself to this, and then take the other person's perspective and just skip having done your perspective. Because we assume you're good at that part, or you know your perspective. There's another question.
If the other person is known to be like rational or half irrational, you can have them writing like it's an irrational excuse.
Ah, that's good. That's very clever. Okay, so the question is, what if the other person is wrong? Or what if the other person is irrational? As you write from their perspective, should you write irrationally in scribbled hand and whatnot? And that's an excellent question. I follow the assignment. Actually try to do what they would do. Write exactly what they would write. And it might just be, you know, like all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy like 10, 25 times or something because they're crazy. But really, take their perspective, because in life we must interact with irrational people, right? So, and we have to understand their perspective. So in some ways, maybe that would be the best way to do this assignment. All right, so let's keep it quiet. Let's keep it quiet. There's a question in the back, sir.
Do you mind if we contact the person to truly get their perspective?
Don't get yourself or me in trouble, but that would be fine. If you would like to do that, and if it helps, that's great, man. Do it. Yeah, yeah. Actually, there was a question back here. What's next? You? Shh. You have a question?
If it was like more of a one-way conflict, like I was pissed off him, but he didn't really get it.
Doesn't matter. What if it was a one-way conflict? You were pissed at that person was not pissed back. Doesn't matter. Please take their perspective and write the essay. Should you provide a summary of what you did last time? No. Just literally write the exact essay that if they had been assigned it. Try your best. Success in this would be to actually nail what they would have written if they were in the class word for word. Obviously, you're not going to do that. It's impossible. But that's what you should try to be approximating. Yes? What if you don't know the reasons for their behavior? Maybe be generous and try to come up with plausible reasons, the most flattering plausible reasons you can for why they did and said the things they did. We got to keep the talking down. We'll do two more questions. Okay, your question, ma'am? No? Yes, you. Yep. Yes. So what if you had the conflict with more than one person? I like that. That's good. Yes. Please try to render everybody's perspective, but do it in 2 pages. Okay. Which may be difficult if you were taking on like a group of 30 people or something, or all of society. Yeah. There's you, sir.
Do you want us to write
Shh.
every sentence, or she would say this, she would have said this?
No, no. Write it in first person from the perspective of the other person. Okay. Good? We're good? Okay. All right. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just do this as well as you can. Okay. All right. So that's the end of that lecture. And actually, let's take a 2-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll do the next lecture. Okay. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Let's get back to paying attention and stuff and learning. I know. We got to learn. I'm dying to learn. I want to learn more. Okay, so attendance sheets. Remember, you need to sign these attendance sheets. People have already turned a couple in. Raise your hand if you haven't signed an attendance sheet. Okay, so here's one. So pass that back and communicate with each other silently. Whoa. Okay, here's one. Can somebody get an attendance sheet to that group of folks there and that group of folks back there? If you have an attendance sheet, pass it that way. Okay, great. So, and I should also tell you, there's a very good chance there'll be a quiz on Tuesday. Oh, God, they're grading us in college. Oh, my God. So do your reading. You're supposed to do your reading by Tuesday of every week. So you're going to be responsible for this week's reading and next week's reading on Tuesday. So that's what we would quiz about. Were we to quiz on Tuesday, there's a very decent chance there'll be a quiz on Tuesday. I have a question, ma'am. No, of course not. What are you talking about? I didn't forget your name. I have a personal relationship with every one of you. Sunny, you have a question. I remember. Quizzes are on lecture and the reading. They'll tend to emphasize the reading, though, because that's the main thing basically I use quizzes to keep you reading. That's the purpose. Because if I didn't, you might stop, and then I would be very, very, very sad. So that's why we're doing quizzes. Question? And we're going to have to, yeah. No need for Scantron. It'll be very simple. It'll be on a sheet of paper or something like that. Bring some paper. Are they cumulative? Tuesday, were we to have a quiz on Tuesday, it would be on this week and next week's reading. So read everything, obviously. You're already reading everything, I know. If you're on the waiting list, it's your call. You might gauge, it's your call. Obviously, if you're going to be in the class, you're going to want to get a great grade. You're going to want to ace everything. So, and it's pretty good material. I don't know, maybe audit the class or something. Okay. So another question, and we got to get going. What's the format of the quiz? Is a series of questions, either short answer or multiple choice. I'm not sure. You'll write them down on a sheet of paper and you'll turn it in. Okay? All right. Cool. That's all you get. All right. So now let's talk about cognitive biases. Let's talk about cognitive dissonance theory. And one thing I want to tell you guys, it's a huge class. There's going to be a lot of temptation to talk with your neighbor. We got to not have that. I'll get very mean. I don't want to be mean. You don't want to see me when I'm mean. It's like the Incredible Hulk. It's a mess. It's a mess. I wear purple shorts and, yeah. So please, let's not talk. You think that I don't see you, but it's amazing how much I see you. It's incredible. I can see people in the back row that have their finger on their nose. I know to you, it's like a stage, and he's not picking his nose. He just had his finger on his nose. He's fine. He's fine. Don't pick on the man. So to you, it's like television. Granted, it's like the worst television show you've ever seen in your life, but it's like a very bad public access television show. But it actually sees back. It's a television. It's like 1984, and I see you, and I see what you're doing. And if you're texting and stuff, like you were texting earlier, that bothered me. You hurt my feelings. And I was going to call you out, but there's about 100 of you were talking or texting at the time. So we're just going to make this kind of blanket statement, and I'll return to it occasionally. Hopefully I won't, actually. So let's just pay attention. Okay. So cognitive biases, cognitive dissonance theory. Let's talk about cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance theory is a big theory of how people arrange their cognitions in their head and how people organize their thoughts. Not consciously, but non-consciously. And cognitive dissonance theory is a big theory that was big in the late 50s and 1960s in psychological social psychology. By the way, if you ever get confused about whether we're in sociology or psychology, just ask me. Sometimes I forget to tell you. Right now we're in psychology. And it was a big theory that kind of came to dominate social psychology for a period of 15 years. And one of the reasons it came to dominate social psychology was that it generated, as a theory, a bunch of novel insights and ideas and predictions about everyday life that we wouldn't have thought of before. One of the criticisms of sociology in social psychology is that it's all common sense. You know, they come in and tell you culture matters, gender matters, all this stuff, and you're like, I totally knew that already. Cognitive dissonance theory is not like that. If all goes well, at the end of this lecture, or it may go into Tuesday, at the end of the cognitive dissonance theory lecture, you'll know something about your own mind that you didn't know when you showed up. Cognitive dissonance theory, by the way, is primarily a theory associated with Leon Festinger, a great social psychologist who went to, or was a professor at, Stanford University. I know. I'm sorry. I really am sorry for bringing that up. Festinger triumphed over his institutional location to make a good theory, one of the few times that's been recorded in Stanford history. I know. Yeah. Okay. Humans have a strong tendency towards cognitive consistency is sort of the main idea of this theory. Well, let's elaborate that. So holding apparently incompatible or logically inconsistent thoughts about ourselves or others or the world produces what we call cognitive dissonance. This feeling of dissonance between your thoughts. This state of dissonance is uncomfortable, and the mind seeks a resolution to that discomfort by rejecting or changing or adding another cognition. Your brain doesn't want to believe logically inconsistent things, and so it will work to try to resolve that dissonance in one of a few ways. And we have a kind of sense of how people restore cognitive consonance or consistency, and we'll go into that. So this dissonance reduction goes on largely outside of your awareness, which is that's why it's so tricky. That's why you didn't know about it. Well, unless you did. But that's why you maybe didn't know about it, is because your brain does this without you being aware of it. And it has to, right? If your brain's going to start changing cognitions around to keep them consistent, your awareness of it would undermine the entire process, right? Because you'd be like aware that the two were actually inconsistent and your mind just flipped or distorted one to make them seem consistent. Question? Yeah.
Can you give a practical example of cognitive dissonance theory?
Yes, I will give you a bunch in a sec. Okay, so examples of cognitive dissonance. Modern and sophisticated artwork tends to jar our sensibilities, challenge our assumptions about the world, or otherwise create cognitive dissonance. This is one of the biggest things that you notice in the difference between sort of high art, sophisticated art, the art maybe that you would learn about in college, and the stuff that you actually enjoy watching or consuming. So what's the difference between like a very sophisticated, like independent film that you might see on IFC or Bravo or something, and a normal film, a popcorn movie that sells an incredible number of tickets and is very, very famous? What's the big difference? I would say the biggest difference is those independent films tend to jar your sensibilities and kind of leave you with dissonance, whereas these popcorn movies either never create dissonance or create dissonance and then fix it. And that's actually a common arc in popular films, is create dissonance and then fix it. Like, what's the average romantic comedy? What happens? Two people come together, they fall in love, then they misunderstand each other in some annoying way. And it's inevitable, but there's something, like they overhear somebody say something. It's, they've been doing it since Pride and Prejudice, there's something, something goes wrong, and I thought you didn't like me, that's why I didn't call you, whatever. So they get torn apart, then that dissonance gets resolved, like, oh my God, I didn't realize he loved me the whole time, and then they come back together, it's beautiful, and the end takes like 3 minutes or something. It used to take longer, but now they just trim it because they're like, you know what happens now. Now, here's a question. Try to name, okay, what's an example of a romantic comedy that does that? Now, you haven't necessarily seen this movie, you just are aware that maybe it's like that. Forgetting Sarah Marshall, that's a good one, yeah. Knocked Up has that too. These are my kinds of romantic comedies. But also When Harry Met Sally, Just What? Just Married. Casablanca, that's a good one, that's classy. We got a classy person over there. Serendipity, exactly. Serendipity it's like the classic example of this. Notting Hill, never seen it, heard that it's like that. What else? What is it? You've Got Mail, totally. Sleepless in Seattle. I mean, in some of these, they literally come together at the end, and it's like in a specific place and stuff. Pretty Woman, thank you. Now, Name a romantic comedy that doesn't have that. Damn. I didn't think you could. I didn't think you could. No, you're right. The Breakup's a terrific example. Romeo and Juliet, too. Well, no, because she's dead, right? Yeah. Titanic. No, I'm going to argue on Titanic. Who said that? Who said that? I'm going to argue that Titanic, that they do come together at the end. But actually, there's no conflict, right? They never don't like each other, right? Oh, they stop liking each other at some point? Okay, there's another one that doesn't work for. But I would still say the standard arc is this, you know, we fall in love, horrible misunderstanding, then come back together. It's often ludicrously rigged, you know. The Wedding Planner, never seen it, heard it's like this. Okay, so it's a standard thing. These movies sell, you know, a lot of tickets, right? What if they didn't come together at the end? Would they do as well? Of course not. Of course not. Okay, so people tend to find this kind of high art and stuff an acquired taste. You know, or even an unacquirable taste. You know, these movies or books or something that have plots where they create cognitive dissonance and they don't resolve it. So what are some other examples of art that uses cognitive dissonance to be original or fancy or sophisticated? And mind you, I'm not making fun of this stuff. This is actually, I love this stuff. Improvisational jazz, punk rock music, the rise of indie rock music in the early 90s was all about having, well, it's about a lot of things, but it's about having guitars with lots of feedback, singers with off-key voices. These are very familiar to you now. And this, you know, to people in like the 50s, they'd be like, that sounds awful, you know? And in a certain way, they maybe are even right. The person has a bad voice. Yes, their guitar is making semi-random noises. But we find this to be nice, right? And we've become used to it. And it actually takes even more feedback and off-tone singing to jar our sensibilities now than it did then. So improvisational jazz, I don't know if you guys listen to, like, you probably don't listen to Sun Ra, Cecil Taylor, these folks. Very, very hard to acquire taste, but if you're into it, it's pretty awesome. Other stuff. In books and movies, complex morality, situations where there's an anti-hero, or the main character is maybe a bad guy or has bad qualities. These are characteristic of more sophisticated art. They create cognitive dissonance. Not everybody ever acquires the taste. So what are some examples of this? Complex morality, lack of good guys, bad guys, anti-heroes, no happy endings. Also, a distinguishing feature of postmodern literature is unreliable, or modern and postmodern literature, is unreliable narrators. And that jars your sensibilities, right? Your assumption is your narrator is going to tell you the truth about the story. But, you know, starting with people like Joseph Conrad and James Joyce, people started to have unreliable narrators that would tell you stuff that you're supposed to be skeptical of and critical of. You can't take at face value. It creates cognitive dissonance. Some people like that. So what are some examples of books like this? Ulysses, a classic unreliable narrator book, in some ways the first postmodern book. The Stranger. Does anybody know the first line of The Stranger by Albert Camus? Come on, somebody does? Come on. It's a great book. Okay, the first line of the book was "Mother died yesterday," or maybe it was today, I think. And you're supposed to say, "Oh my God, this is weird. This guy isn't even keeping track of when his mother dies." You know, it's like at the very beginning they're establishing this guy is not a sympathetic character. He's not a well-rounded moral character. Catcher in the Rye, you know, he starts off immediately talking about how everybody's a phony. You know, great book, but you have to be skeptical of him as a narrator in order to understand the story. Crime and Punishment, your lead character kills somebody within about 80 pages. Sorry about that. Crime and Punishment, you would have guessed that, right? Yeah. Don't give away. Why are you giving away the end of The Usual Suspects? Yes. Okay. Would it be cognitive dissonance producing to have a story where the bad guy winds up being somebody different than you think it would be? Absolutely. Absolutely. Twist endings and stuff, yeah. Movies, The Grand Illusion, which we'll watch in class, which is always sort of saying, you think this is the good guy, you think this is the bad guy, we're going to flip it up on you and blur the lines between the good guys and bad guys, the in-groups and the out-groups. The Graduate. Have you seen The Graduate? It's a great film, right? Filmed partly in Berkeley. I love this film. And in the film, you have sympathy for this guy and this love story that he has, even though he's already had an affair with the woman he falls in love with's mother. So this is a very strange, almost Oedipal kind of scenario. Pulp Fiction, right? Your lead characters are funny, you relate to them, you enjoy them, and they're killers. They're hired contract killers. And now, seemingly, every other film that comes out is a Pulp Fiction ripoff where your lead characters are hired killers. Sideways, who's your hero in that? Paul Giamatti. How could that possibly be the case? It makes no sense. But you're rooting for him, right? You want him to do well, despite his self-loathing and disgusting characteristics and whatnot. Scarface, the movie Scarface. Yeah, you find yourself probably rooting for Al Pacino. And they even give him a moral side, right? Like he won't kill children, But then, but he'll kill dozens and dozens of adults if he can get more cocaine. So that's a messed up movie, man. Okay, so what are some examples from art? Indulge me here while I get to try to pretend like I'm an art history professor, a very bad art history professor. This painting by Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase, debuted at some art expo in Paris, I think early this century. Those of you who are art history majors are laughing at me. I'm sure I'm getting the details wrong. Laugh away. That's fair. Now, supposedly, when this was revealed at this art expo, there was a riot. Can you imagine that? That's how seriously they take art in France. That people were tearing their hair out, fighting one another, because they couldn't handle the dissonance. They were just blown away. They were like, this is not art. Oh my God, you've challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. So why does this create cognitive dissonance? It's abstract, and I think the big reason was supposedly you can't clearly see the nude descending a staircase, okay? Okay. Kind of, but not really. It's not at all representational. It's not even impressionistic. It's abstract. Okay. What about this, right? This is classic. Do you know the name of this? Salvador Dali. Do you know the name of the painting? Persistence of memory, right on. What causes cognitive dissonance about this? What doesn't? Yeah, everything about it. Okay, cool. Yeah. The melting clocks, the ants, whatever that freaky eye thing is. Definitely. By the way, if you ever see this, I think it's at the Met in New York, I want to say. Do you know where it is? The MoMA? Okay. It's tiny. It's weirdly tiny. It's a little bit bigger than a postcard. So that's way bigger than it. Okay. This one by, I believe, René Magritte. This is a surrealist painting. What does this mean when translated to English? This is not a pipe. Why does that cause cognitive dissonance? Okay. Right. Okay. Question in back? Question in back? No. Okay. This one. Who did this? Does anybody know who did this painting? Exactly. Roy Lichtenstein. I love this guy. I have this painting in my office, actually. What causes cognitive dissonance about this? I don't know, it might not be a painting. It might be a lithograph. I don't know the difference. I'm not a proper art history professor. What causes cognitive dissonance about it? In order to read it, you have to undo its message, right? If it's this person peering into the room we're in saying, I can see the whole room and there's nobody in it, for that to even be read, you'd have to be in the room that he's peering into, seeing him, and he'd have to see you. So by definition, there's somebody in the room. Who's this? Right, Rothko. What causes cognitive dissonance about this? Exactly, exactly. You could paint this, right? Or see me, I really think you could paint this. Yeah, right. Weirdly, Rothko's a real acquired taste. When I first saw it, I was like, that is bullshit. That is not art. I could paint that, blah, 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 And actually, now I really like Rothko. I think it's good stuff. Okay, this is a sculpture, again, by our friend Marcel Duchamp, the one who did Nude Descending a Staircase. And he submitted this to some art expo thing where he was invited to submit something. And it's called Fountain. And what causes cognitive dissonance about this? It's a friggin' urinal. It's not a fountain. And at a higher level, this was one of those kind of landmark, like Nude Descending a Staircase, his painting. This was one of those landmark pieces of art where people were like, that isn't art. I don't buy that that's art. With Rothko, you're like, well, that's a painting. There's paint involved. I think I could do it, but it looks kind of cool, whatever, With this, you're like, no, he took a urinal off the wall. He wrote some other dude's name on it, or a woman, whatever, R. Mutt, and then called it something it isn't. This is really not art, And this is one of those things where he's challenging, what is art, anyway. Yeah. So, and actually you can see a reproduction of this. Has anybody ever seen this? There's like 5 of them, right, or something, I think. Where can you see this? At SF MoMA? Is that what you said? Did you say Stockholm? Where? Oh. Right, and somebody right, okay, so some have been stolen. Somebody destroyed one, I think, with like a hammer or something, I want to say. Somebody who was outraged that he was defining the obvious definition of art. But I believe that you can see it at the SF MoMA in San Francisco. So go over there, see it. It's even better in person. It's not. It's exactly what it looks like, but it's famous, so that's why people go to art museums, right? So, yeah. Yes, sir, you have a question. Yes, Andy Warhol's paintings of virtually anything, really, but yeah, especially the Campbell soup cans, where it's just a representational, realist picture of a Campbell soup can. What's art about that? That's the point, you know. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so these are examples of cognitive dissonance and things that create cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, right? That's why we consider these things high art. That's why you don't have Marcel Duchamp's fountain on your wall. You have, you know, something that looks better. It's because it produces an enormous amount of dissonance. It's very hard to understand why it's even art. So, dissonance reduction. What do people do when cognitive dissonance strikes, you know, like a fever or a disease? When people find that their cognitions are at odds or somehow inconsistent, they seek to resolve that dissonance and create consonance. They don't do this consciously. Their brain just does it in the normal course of thinking and perception and cognition. So how do you resolve dissonance between 2 thoughts? Let's call them A and B, and for some reason they're logically contradictory. And now we'll get a few examples. So one thing you can do is you can stop believing one of the thoughts. So you can disregard one of the cognitions. Alternatively, you could flip your belief in A or B to become logically consistent. If A or B are logically inconsistent, you could start believing not B or not A and make them consistent. Or you could distort one to fall in line with the other, sort of shift and change A or B so that it's less inconsistent with the other one that it's contradictory with. Or you could add an additional cognition that somehow resolves the conflict. And these are considered the 4 kind of main ways that you resolve cognitive consistency or consonance in the face of dissonance. Disregard, change belief, distort, or add. So now it'd be useful to do some examples. So let's do that. Okay, so for example, a friend of yours says something that's offensive to you. What could you do? Cognitively, you're likely to do one of the following, according to cognitive dissonance theory. So yeah, you find this offensive, but the person is your friend who you like and respect, so this creates cognitive dissonance. So one thing you could do is you could disregard. You could disregard the offending comment, or you could disregard the friendship. You're probably more likely, one guiding principle of cognitive dissonance theory, you're more likely to do the one that's sort of easier to do. So if you're strong friends with the person, you're more likely to disregard the offensive comment. And I would say most of the time that's what happens, right? You know, your friend says something offensive, and you sort of go, okay, you know, and you hope they don't do it again. I don't know if that's what you should do, but that's probably the thing that happens most often. Another thing you can do, you can change. You could adopt the offensive belief, or you could change your view of your friend. You could change one of these cognitions that's at odds. This person's my friend, that's an offensive comment. You could change this person's my friend, they're less my friend, or this was actually not that offensive of a comment. Or it's not offensive at all, I'm actually going to adopt that offensive belief and make it inoffensive to me. Distort. You could pretend your friend meant something else. Maybe you misheard her. Or you could add a new thought. Maybe your friend was having a bad day, something like that. You come up with some new cognition that resolves the dissonance. So here's another one. For example, you think you're good at basketball, but you get beat in one-on-one. I have never experienced this, but this is some sort of hypothetical. I read about this in a book, and it sounds terrible. That would be terrible. So this creates cognitive dissonance for you. You think you're fantastic at basketball. Of course you're right. And then you get beaten one-on-one. What can you do? You could disregard. You could disregard or forget the incident. That's what I have apparently done. You could change your cognition. You could revise your view of your abilities. You could say, I'm not that great at basketball after all. You could distort. You could explain away the outcome. You could say, I'm having a bad day, my opponent cheated, they double dribbled on the game-winning point, etc. Alternatively, you could add a new cognition. You could maybe seek out new games that you're sure to win, that then restore your cognitive consistency, adding cognitions of like, oh, I may have lost, to Jeremy, but I beat Jake and Nick. A very literal example from my growing up. Jeremy was very good. Okay, so here's another example. You think you're very healthy, right? You live in the Bay Area, you're an undergraduate, you probably do think you're healthy, and you're probably right. But your doctor says you're very unhealthy. It's a weird example, but anyway, okay. So what doctor would do that, right? Like, you're very unhealthy. So you could disregard. You could disregard your doctor's assessment. Just pretend it didn't happen. That's what I would do, and that's what we encourage here. You could change. You could revise your view of your health to say, I'm less healthy than I think I am. You take into account your doctor's advice. You could distort. You could reinterpret your doctor's words. Well, well, my doctor said that, but he was thinking about, my aorta, not my whole body. Therefore, I am still healthy. You could add a cognition. You could adopt new practices, maybe, that then allow you to, again, feel healthy. You say, well, I thought I was healthy. My doctor said I was unhealthy, but now I run, 6 miles a week, and so now I am healthy again, or I can believe that again. Another example, you love your partner, but she or he is always criticizing you, your boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, partner, what have you. So what could you do? You could disregard. You could try to ignore the criticisms. Have you been in a relationship like that? I have. And it wasn't funny. I don't know why everybody was laughing at first. You could change. You could revise your view of yourself or your partner. That would be a healthy thing to do, probably, the partner one. If they're criticizing you all the time, perhaps revise your view of them. Well, unless they're right. You could distort. You could rationalize his or her behaviors. Abusive relationships, right? People do this, right? They're getting all this mental and physical abuse. People who don't exit the relationships often will sort of distort the message and say, well, the person was justified in their criticisms. Or they might change their belief to say they're right. I am awful in the ways that he or she is telling me I am. And those would be very unhealthy ways to deal with relentless criticism from a partner. Or you could add new cognitions. You could think about new good traits. Not of your partner, of you, or small, wait, what? Oh, okay, yeah, I see what I was thinking. So you love your partner, but he or she criticizes you. You're tempted to dislike your partner, so one thing you could do is you could add cognitions. You could think about good traits that your partner has, or small, kind behaviors that him or her does that sort of make the criticism seem less bad in comparison. Okay, so these are some examples of dissonance reduction. Let's talk about a case study. So I told you that this Leon Fessinger person, don't worry, it's okay. This Leon Fessinger person, who later was a professor at a bad university, he started out as a professor at the University of Minnesota, which we have no problem with. That's fine. And when he was a professor at the University of Minnesota, he and a couple other people, including Stanley Schachter, who is also a famous social psychologist, the three of them got really interested in this cult that was in Chicago. And it was a doomsday cult. And what they decided to do was study it. And it's a form of research in psychology that's uncommon. But in sociology, it's more common. It's participant observation. They decided, this sounds like a really fascinating cult. They'd seen an ad in the paper. They'd heard something about it. They're like, let's go study this. Let's go study some extreme behavior, extreme group behavior. Maybe we'll learn something from this. So what they did was they went to Chicago and joined up with this cult. And then they paid some research assistants to also sign up. And the leader of this cult, there were two leaders, but we'll focus on the female leader of the cult because she was kind of the main leader, Mrs. Keach. And she, this doomsday cult, believed that there were these people, these aliens called the Guardians. And Mrs. Keach would communicate with these Guardians. No one else could hear them, but she could. And she would transcribe their messages in kind of like these free writing, sort of furious sort of sessions where she would write and write and write. And everybody else in the cult would be like, oh my God, what are the Guardians saying? And the Guardians warned about a great flood, but they promised that in this great flood they would save believers, people who believed in the Guardians. Okay, so the people got together one night, the night before the big flood, and they're hoping that a UFO is going to come down and save them, because this is what Mrs. Keach has written out in one of her sessions, right? And they get together, and Mrs. Keach is like, okay, apparently the Guardians are saying you need to get rid of all the metal, any metal you're wearing on your body, and there's 10 minutes left, right, before midnight, when the great flood is going to happen and engulf and destroy the entire world, including Chicago. And the Guardians are going to come down and save us. We got like 8, 9 minutes, something like that. And she's like, okay, we got to get rid of all the metal. And they're like tearing off the metal from their bodies. They're tearing off buttons and zippers and stuff, which is a pretty weird image. And then 1 clock passes midnight. And they're like, okay, weirdly, there's no flood and no aliens picking us up to save us from the flood. What's going on? So nothing happens. And so this causes great dissonance, right? They're like, we've been believing this for a long time. We've invested in this cult. And now there's no alien spaceship. There's no flood. Great cognitive dissonance. So what do they decide? The clock is wrong. That clock is right, the one that's slower. So then they start paying attention to that clock. And they wait for that clock to hit midnight. And then finally it hits midnight. And both clocks pass midnight. The prophecy fails. And when Fessinger wrote up a book about this with his 2 colleagues, they called it When Prophecy Fails. And this is really where the study starts. So they don't know what to do. They're freaking out. One person gets up, walks out. It's just like, this is bullshit. A few hours later, most people stay, though, because they've invested so much in believing in this cult, right? So a few hours later, Keach starts writing an explanation from the Guardians. She gets one of these sessions. The Guardians are speaking to her. And what she hears is their faith had saved the world from the flood. Because they believed so much in the aliens that were going to come and save them, the Guardians, the flood didn't happen and they were spared. Which doesn't make any sense because the Guardians weren't supposed to be in charge of the flood, I don't think. But, well, whatever, it really doesn't make any sense. So the group, which was now being covered by the media, and the media was kind of like sitting there chuckling like, all right, we're going to get a good story in the morning when the flood doesn't happen. They hastily put together a sort of clumsy press release and tell the media that their faith saved the world. So why did they do this? Their prophecy failed. Shouldn't they have all done what the first guy did and just jumped up and said, this is BS, and left? Why is it? Why'd they stick it out? Why did they hang around for a few more hours for Keach to come up with some kind of explanation? And why did they then believe that explanation? Well, here's what a couple people said. One person said, I have to believe that the flood is coming because I've spent all my money. I quit my job. I quit computer school. I have to believe. Okay, I've given up, another person said, I've given up just about everything I have. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. I have to believe. And there isn't any other truth. And so they're just spelling it out, right? They're just spelling out cognitive dissonance theory. I have 2 cognitions, that this didn't happen and that it would, because Guardians are real. I need to believe this one for a variety of reasons. Therefore, when the 2 are in conflict, I'm sticking with the one I'm more invested in. The guy who walked out, probably not so much, right? Okay, one other case study. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Have you ever heard of this? Okay, this was like the biggest recorded earthquake in human history, I believe. It was 9 on the Richter scale, or it's estimated historically. That's unbelievable, right? That's horrific. Levels Lisbon in Portugal. Totally destroys it. Here's a picture of that. Not pretty. I don't think, okay. So that's exact. That was a photograph, actually. Okay, so there were widespread effects of the Lisbon earthquake, which challenged people's sensibilities about the world. First, there was systematic seismological research. Seismology is an area started because people wanted to stop this from happening again. I just threw that in there because I find it interesting. But also, there was this huge effect on philosophy and the Enlightenment. Famous philosophers, moral philosophers like Rousseau, Kant, Voltaire wrote about it and were heavily influenced by it. And what it did was it threatened people's belief in God. And in a way, it had a permanent effect on European intellectual thinking. Because it created this question, which was the question of theodicy. How could this level of evil exist in a world governed by God? How can a benevolent, omnipotent God exist if terrible things like the Lisbon earthquake happened to good people? They looked at the Lisbon earthquake and they saw nothing good in it. And it challenged the fiber of their moral fabric, their religious beliefs. And in a way, it was the birth of modern secularism, which is a tradition that continues in European intellectual thought, and the birth of moral philosophy independent of religion. And it happened from an earthquake that created cognitive dissonance. So that's it for today. We'll resume on Tuesday. And please get the attendance sheets in. Make sure you're on there and get your assignment in if you haven't already. And have a great weekend.